falling in love with Sarah felt effortless. She saw me, truly saw me, for who I was, not where I came from. Our connection was easy, genuine, built on shared laughter, late-night conversations about everything and nothing, and a mutual understanding that bypassed the superficial layers of the world. She was brilliant, kind, and beautiful. To me, she was everything. Her family, the Ashworths, were different. They belonged to a world I only knew from magazines and news headlines. Old money, established in finance and philanthropy, with a name that carried weight in certain circles. Their life was one of country clubs, exclusive galas, and generational wealth that spoke of power and privilege. My background, by contrast, was modest. Middle-class, hardworking parents, state university education, focused on building a career from the ground up in a field that felt meaningful, but wasn't particularly glamorous or lucrative in its early stages. Sarah had told me her parents might be a little traditional. I tried to prepare myself, but nothing could have braced me for the reality of their disapproval. The formal dinner invitation to their sprawling home, nestled in an exclusive tree-lined neighborhood, felt less like a welcoming gesture and more like a summons. Mr. and Mrs. Ashworth were gracious hosts on the surface. Polite smiles, impeccable manners, a home filled with art and antiques that probably cost more than my annual salary. But beneath the polished veneer lay a chilling coldness, a subtle but undeniable disdain. Their questions about my family, my education, my job, my prospects weren't born out of genuine interest, but out of a clear desire to size me up and find me wanting. "Your work at the nonprofit sector," Mr. Ashworth commented, his tone polite but dismissive after I explained my job. "Very noble, I'm sure. Not quite the usual path for someone hoping to provide a certain lifestyle." Mrs. Ashworth, with a delicate sip of her wine, added, "We have certain expectations, you see, for Sarah. She's always been accustomed to a certain standard. Someone who understands her world, someone with a commensurate background." The phrase commensurate background hung in the air, a polite way of saying, "not you." They didn't need to say I wasn't rich enough, or well-connected enough, or from the right kind of family. Their words, their tone, their entire demeanor screamed it. They spoke about circles, about maintaining standards, about the future they envisioned for their daughter, a future that clearly had no place for someone like me. Sarah tried to interject, to highlight my qualities, my ambition, the love we shared. But her parents gently, firmly steered the conversation back to practicalities, to suitability, to the world they inhabited and expected their daughter's partner to be a part of. Leaving their perfect, imposing house that night felt like being cast out. The sting of their dismissal was sharp, visceral. I hadn't just been judged. I had been found utterly inadequate. My worth measured and discarded based on my background, my perceived lack of future in their terms. I felt a burning humiliation, an anger at their arrogance and their narrow definition of what constituted a valuable person. More than anything, I felt a crushing helplessness against their established power, their control over Sarah's world, and their absolute certainty that I was simply not suitable. The perfect door to Sarah's life had just been slammed in my face, and the message was devastatingly clear. The drive away from the Ashworths' mansion that night was the longest of my life. The silence in the car between Sarah and me was thick with everything left unsaid, with the chasm that had just been brutally exposed between our worlds. Her hand, in mine, felt impossibly fragile. In the days and weeks that followed, the reality of her family's opposition became an unyielding wall. Phone calls were monitored, visits became difficult, every interaction was shadowed by their disapproval. Sarah fought, bless her heart, trying to bridge the gap, trying to make them see us, but the pressure on her was immense. a lifetime of expectation and tradition bearing down, and their message to me, subtle yet unmistakable, was delivered through various channels. I was not welcome. I was not suitable. Period. The breaking point wasn't a single dramatic argument, but a slow, heartbreaking realization. We loved each other, fiercely. But love wasn't enough to overcome the entrenched power and absolute disapproval of her family. They weren't going to change their minds. They wouldn't risk their status, their legacy, their daughter's perceived proper future for someone like me. Sitting across from Sarah in a quiet coffee shop, the decision hanging heavy between us, felt like the end of my world. Tears streamed down her face, mirroring the ache in my own chest. We admitted with raw pain that we couldn't make it work. The pressure was too great, the barrier too high. Staying together would only hurt us both more, forcing us into a constant, unwinnable battle. Ending it was the most painful act of love we could offer each other. Walking away from that coffee shop, away from Sarah, was the hardest thing I had ever done. The grief was a physical weight crushing my chest. The city, the places we had shared, felt empty, hollow. For a while, the pain of lost love consumed me. But beneath the grief, the sting of the Ashworths' rejection festered. The memory of Mr. Ashworth's polite dismissal, Mrs. Ashworth's cool disdain, the word unsuitable echoing in my mind. It wasn't just personal hurt. It was the burning injustice of being judged and discarded based on my background, my perceived lack of inherent worth in their eyes. They hadn't seen my ambition, my sincerity, my potential. They had only seen my family's modest status, my non-traditional job, my lack of an established name. That sting, that injustice, began to fuel a cold, hard resolve. I wouldn't let their definition of suitable be the final word on my value. I wouldn't spend my life mourning what I had lost or wishing I was someone I wasn't. My goal shifted. It wasn't just about getting over Sarah, or even just building a successful career for myself. It was about building a kind of power, a kind of status, a kind of suitability that transcended their narrow, insular world. Something based purely on merit, achievement, and influence, earned through sheer will and capability. I would prove them wrong, not by trying to join their ranks, but by building my own. I knew I couldn't do it here, haunted by memories and the proximity of their world. The path I needed to take was outside their view, in a field where my background was irrelevant and only results mattered. It required complete focus, years of dedication, and operating entirely off their radar. I made the difficult decision to leave, to move to a different city, to pour all my energy into a new direction, a new career path that held the potential for significant growth and influence, but was far removed from the Ashworths' traditional world of finance and socialite. Galas. Packing my bags, leaving the familiar behind, felt like stepping off a cliff into the unknown. The pain of the breakup was still raw, the sting of the rejection still burned. But beneath it was a quiet, fierce determination. They thought I wasn't suitable? They thought they could dismiss me? I was leaving their world. But I wasn't giving up. I was going to build something they couldn't ignore, something that would force them to look at me differently. The quiet rise, fueled by the pain of being deemed unsuitable, had just begun. Leaving the city where I had known Sarah, where the Ashworths' world felt omnipresent, was like shedding a skin. I moved across the country, to a city bustling with a different kind of energy, one built on innovation, technology, and ambition, earned, not inherited. It was a place where pedigree mattered less than performance, where your background was secondary to your capability. This was fertile ground for the future I intended to build. I threw myself into a new career path, one deliberately chosen for its potential for rapid growth based purely on merit. I focused on data infrastructure and analytics, a field that demanded relentless learning, precision, and the ability to build complex systems from the ground up. It was a world away from the established traditional sectors where the Ashworth name held sway. The early years were a grind, long hours spent staring at code and data streams in small, anonymous office spaces, living frugally in a tiny apartment, ramen a frequent dinner option, attending industry workshops and online courses to constantly update my skills, networking with people who talked about algorithms and venture capital, not socialite galas or country club memberships. There were moments of doubt, of exhaustion, of missing the life I had lost and questioning the path I was on. But the memory of that dinner at the Ashworths, the sting of their polite disdain, the word unsuitable, it was a constant, burning fuel. It reminded me why I was doing this, not just for success itself, but to prove them fundamentally wrong about what constituted worth and potential. Their definition of suitable was narrow, limited by their own world. I was building my own definition, one byte of data, one successful project, one hard-won relationship at a time. Maintaining absolute secrecy from my old life was paramount. No social media posts that could be traced, no contact with anyone who might inadvertently mention my whereabouts or new career to someone in the Ashworth's orbit. I severed ties cleanly, focusing entirely on building my new foundation, operating completely off their radar. They believed I was simply gone, no longer a factor in their carefully curated world. Slowly, painstakingly, the foundation began to solidify. Small successes accumulated. A complex data system I designed streamlined operations for an early client. A challenging project I led came in under budget and ahead of schedule. Recognition came, not through a mention in a society column, but through a promotion, a bonus, an offer to lead a more significant team. I was building a reputation within this new field, earning respect based purely on my results and expertise. The skills I was acquiring, the networks I was building, were in a world parallel to, but entirely distinct from, the Ashworths. They operated in a world of established wealth and traditional power structures. I was learning to navigate the complex, rapidly changing currents of data, technology, and merit-based influence. It was a different kind of power, quiet and built from the ground up. Years passed, marked not by social seasons but by product launches, funding rounds, and the increasing complexity of the systems I was building. The raw pain of losing Sarah had faded, leaving a bittersweet memory, but the cold determination fueled by her family's rejection remained a driving force. I was no longer the unsuitable young man from a modest background. I was becoming someone else, building a quiet strength and capability in a world where the Ashworth's definition of status held no meaning. The long, silent climb had begun. 10 years. A decade had passed since I walked away from that coffee shop, since I left the city where the Ashworth's world felt so impossibly large and my own so painfully small. 10 years of relentless focus, of pouring every ounce of my energy into the new path I had chosen. The early struggles, the long hours, the ramen dinners, they were now distant memories, the foundation of a different reality. I was no longer just building a career. I had built an enterprise. My company, specializing in advanced data analytics and tech infrastructure for complex supply chains and financial markets, had grown from a small startup into a significant player in its niche. We were innovative, agile, and our technology was becoming indispensable to companies navigating the complexities of modern global business. My success wasn't built on a family name, or inherited wealth, or connections forged on golf courses and country clubs. It was built on code, on data, on identifying inefficiencies and building systems to solve them. It was built on attracting brilliant minds who cared about results, not pedigree. It was built every single day on proving capability through undeniable achievement. I had built my own formidable power base, an influence derived purely from merit and the value my company created. My own coin, forged in the fires of ambition and fueled by the memory of being deemed unsuitable. Within my field, my name carried weight. I spoke at national conferences. My company was featured in industry publications. Investors sought us out. I had achieved a level of success and influence that transcended the limited view the Ashworths had had of my prospects all those years ago. And yet, I knew that in the Ashworths' world, my name likely meant little, if anything. They operated in the upper echelons of traditional finance and established real estate, worlds that moved at a different pace and valued different metrics. My kind of success, built on algorithms and data pipelines, wasn't the kind that typically made headlines in their society pages. They might have vaguely heard of companies like mine, benefiting from the technological shifts we were driving, but they wouldn't connect it to the earnest young man they had dismissed as unsuitable a decade ago. I was off their radar, operating in a parallel universe of earned influence. But the two worlds weren't entirely separate. The currents of technology and data analytics that my company specialized in were beginning to subtly reshape the very industries the Ashworths inhabited. The efficiency we brought to supply chains impacted the cost of goods they invested in. The insights from complex data analysis affected the financial markets they traded in. I would occasionally see news about their world, articles about market shifts, challenges facing traditional finance firms, the difficulties established companies had adapting to new technologies. Sometimes I'd read about deals or problems and recognize, with a quiet sense of irony, that the solutions or the challenges were directly related to the kind of expertise my company possessed, the kind of expertise they had implicitly scorned. The memory of their disdain had faded as a source of raw pain, but it remained as a quiet motivator, a reminder of the arbitrary nature of inherited status. I had built my empire, forged my influence, far away from their judgment. I was a figure of power in my own right, respected in my field, with resources and connections that had nothing to do with my background. I continued to watch, to build, to grow my influence in this separate world. I was ready. I had forged the key to my own future, a key that could unlock doors the Ashworths didn't even know existed. The quiet rise was complete. I was now the master of my own domain, patiently waiting for the moment when the two worlds would collide, and the Ashworths would learn the true price of deeming someone unsuitable based on a narrow, outdated definition of worth. Life in my world, the one built on data and merit, continued its upward trajectory. My company was thriving, our influence in our niche growing. I was a respected figure, navigating complex deals and strategic expansions, a stark contrast to the unsuitable young man of a decade ago. The memory of the Ashworths' dismissal had receded into a quiet, distant ache, less a source of pain and more a reminder of how far I had come, how differently worth was measured in my earned reality. Then, cracks began to appear in the polished facade of their world. I first noticed it not in the society pages but in the business news. Reports about unexpected volatility in a specific sector of commercial real estate where the Ashworths were known to have significant holdings. Whispers about an established financial firm facing headwinds due to shifts in regulatory enforcement. Regarding complex derivatives, the kind of instruments often used in high-stakes leveraging. These weren't headlines directly naming the Ashworths, but they were about the ground they stood on, and the tremors were undeniable. Soon, the news became more specific. Articles mentioning Ashworth & Co., the family firm, reporting unexpected losses tied to a combination of real estate devaluation and complex leveraged investments gone sour. Rumors of legal challenges emerging from past deals, complicated by new interpretations of financial regulations. It wasn't just a bad quarter. It felt deeper, more fundamental. From my vantage point, with my expertise in data analytics and understanding of market dynamics, I could see the underlying forces at play, forces that traditional financial strategies and old-school connections might not be equipped to handle. Their world, built on established wealth and predictable structures, was being disrupted by the very kind of rapid, complex changes my world thrived on. The news reports grew more frequent, more serious. The language shifted from challenges to significant exposure, mounting legal pressure. Public statements from Ashworth & Co. were increasingly terse, lacking the usual air of confident control. I saw subtle signs of their struggle. Properties quietly listed for sale, reports of strained relationships with longtime business partners, cancellations of prominent social events that were usually mainstays of their calendar. They were trying to deal with it using their usual tools. Their formidable legal team was engaged. Their connections in the financial district were undoubtedly being leveraged. Their PR firm was likely working overtime to manage the narrative. But it wasn't working. The problem seemed to require a different kind of expertise, a different kind of leverage, one that existed outside their traditional network and playbook. The irony was sharp. The very status and wealth they had used to deem me unsuitable, the foundation of the world they believed was superior, was now under severe threat. Their established power, while vast, had limitations against this specific, modern crisis. As the weeks turned into months, the reports became bleaker. The scale of the financial losses was becoming apparent. The legal challenges weren't going away. The desperation, though carefully masked in public, was palpable through the increasingly grim news filtering out about the Ashworths' situation. They were clearly running out of options within their own world. They were reaching a point where their traditional power wasn't enough to save them, leaving them vulnerable and, perhaps for the first time in a long time, truly in need. I watched from my separate world, a world they had never valued, knowing that the solution they desperately needed might exist in the last place they would ever think to look. The Ashworths' crisis deepened with alarming speed. The news reports grew grimmer, detailing asset freezes, emergency board meetings, and mounting legal pressures. Their usual maneuvers, leveraging political connections, calling in favors, from titans of traditional finance, seemed ineffective against the specific nature of the storm they were facing. It wasn't just a matter of capital. It was a complex unraveling of past deals under new regulatory scrutiny, a technological mismatch in a rapidly changing market, a problem that required a kind of expertise their established world didn't readily offer. From my vantage point, operating in the world of advanced data analytics and niche financial strategies, I could see why they were struggling. Their traditional structures weren't built to handle this kind of complex, data-driven, regulatory entanglement. They needed a solution that existed outside their gilded cage. I continued to observe, my success in my own field providing a strange counterpoint to their public decline. I saw reports about the high-powered and undoubtedly expensive consultants and legal teams they had brought in to try and salvage the situation. They were clearly desperate, casting a wider net than their usual circle. And that wider net eventually snagged on my world. I learned later that it was one of their top-tier crisis management consultants who, in analyzing the specific nature of the Ashworths' financial and regulatory predicament, identified my company and my particular expertise in navigating complex data sets tied to historical financial structures as a potential, albeit unconventional, solution. My name came up in their desperate brainstorming sessions, linked to the very specific type of problem the Ashworths were facing. I can only imagine the reaction in the room when my name was first mentioned. The young man they had dismissed as unsuitable, whose prospects were so limited, now recommended as the person who might hold the key to saving their empire. Disbelief must have warred with their ingrained pride. But as their crisis worsened, necessity, I suspected, began to erode their arrogance. Their traditional avenues were failing. The clock was ticking. The man they had scorned was becoming their only viable option. The contact didn't come directly from Mr. or Mrs. Ashworth. It was a formal email addressed to my office, from the Chief of Staff for Ashworth & Co. It was polite, professional, requesting a confidential meeting to discuss a matter of significant strategic importance, where my company's expertise in data analytics was highly relevant. There was no mention of the past, no hint of personal connection. Just a business request, couched in urgent but formal language. Reading that email in my corner office, looking out at the city skyline, a view earned through years of relentless work not inherited, a cold, calculated satisfaction settled over me. They needed me. The family who had looked down on me, who had deemed me unworthy of their daughter and their world, was now reaching out, seeking my help to save the very world they had used to judge me. I instructed my assistant to respond professionally. I agreed to a meeting, but on my terms. My office, my schedule, no rushed appointments to fit their convenience. The power dynamic had already begun to shift, even before we were in the same room. As the date for the meeting approached, the irony of it all was almost overwhelming. Years ago, I had stood on their doorstep, hoping for acceptance, feeling small and powerless. Now, they were coming to mine, humbled by circumstance, seeking the very expertise they had once believed I lacked the capacity to ever attain. The long, silent journey from unsuitable suitor to potential savior was complete. The confrontation I had never sought in the past, but had quietly prepared for in my own way, was finally at hand. They were coming to look up to the person they had once looked down upon. My office is on the top floor, a space designed for clarity and strategic thinking. Glass walls offering a view of the city skyline, a large, uncluttered desk, comfortable chairs arranged for conversation. It's a world away from the old apartment I lived in when I first met Sarah, a world built piece by piece, earned through every long hour and every calculated risk. This was my territory. The Ashworths arrived, punctual and accompanied by a stern-faced lawyer and a smooth-talking consultant. Mr. and Mrs. Ashworth, the very people who had sat across from me at their imposing dining table all those years ago, now sat across from me at mine. They looked different. Still impeccably dressed, still projecting a semblance of their old status, but the effortless confidence was gone, replaced by a visible strain, a tension around their eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and mounting pressure. Their usual air of casual superiority was muted, replaced by an uncomfortable formality. Small talk was minimal. They got straight to the point, their voices betraying the severity of their situation. The consultant led the presentation, detailing the crisis that had befallen Ashworth & Co., the unraveling of past deals, the complex legal and regulatory entanglements, the scale of the financial exposure. They laid bare the problem they couldn't solve with their traditional resources, their network of powerful friends, their usual legal maneuvers. They spoke of needing a specialized kind of data analysis, a deep understanding of a niche market, and connections that existed outside their standard reach. As they spoke, I listened intently. Their problem, complex and devastating to them, was built on the very structures and data flows that I navigated daily in my own business. Their crisis points were intricately linked to the kind of systems I understood, the kind of information I knew how to leverage. I saw the desperation in their eyes as they described their failed attempts to find a solution, the limits of their traditional power exposed by a modern, intricate problem. The consultant finished, looking expectantly at me. Then, Mr. Ashworth cleared his throat, his gaze finally meeting mine directly. There was a flicker of the old arrogance, quickly overshadowed by necessity. "We've been advised," he said, his voice a little stiff, "that your expertise in my field is unparalleled, that your company might be uniquely positioned to help us see a path forward," Mrs. Ashworth added, her voice softer but tight with unspoken urgency. "We are in a very difficult position, Alex. We need a solution." This was it, the moment I had quietly, fiercely prepared for over a decade. They were sitting in my office, admitting their vulnerability, asking for my help to save the very empire whose status they had used to deem me unworthy. "Based on what you've described," I said, my voice calm and measured, the subtle power in it rooted in earned capability, not inherited status. "And my work in this field, I believe I understand the core issue of your predicament." I paused, letting the full weight of my next words land. "And I believe that I possess the specific knowledge, the data analysis capabilities, and yes, the connections required to navigate this crisis and find a path toward resolution." The impact of my statement was palpable. Mr. and Mrs. Ashworth's faces, already strained, showed a complex mix of relief, disbelief, and perhaps a touch of shame. The last vestiges of their old arrogance crumbled. They saw not the unsuitable young man from a modest background, but the powerful figure sitting across from them, the one holding the key to their survival. Their advisor looked on, perhaps relieved to have found a solution, but also witnessing a dramatic, personal reckoning. The power dynamic was undeniable, complete. They had come to my territory, humbling themselves by necessity, to seek help from the person they had once looked down upon. I held the solution they desperately needed, and they knew it. The conversation shifted, no longer about my suitability, but about the terms of engagement, the conditions under which I would deploy my expertise to save the Ashworth legacy. The long journey from being deemed unworthy to becoming indispensable was complete. The reckoning had arrived. The tension in my office remained palpable after I stated my capability to solve the Ashworth's crisis. They knew I held the key to their survival, and the power dynamic had completely inverted. Mr. Ashworth, his voice tight with necessity, asked about the terms under which I would be willing to help. This wasn't about revenge, not in the way they might have feared. It wasn't about demanding a piece of their empire for myself, simply for the sake of wealth, or even about forcing them to accept a reconciliation with Sarah. The years had passed, lives had moved on. This was about recognition, about respect, about proving that worth isn't just inherited status, but earned capability. "My help comes with conditions," I stated, my voice calm but firm. "Conditions that ensure this problem is truly and fundamentally solved, preventing it from resurfacing later. This will require full transparency and direct involvement from my team, leveraging our specific data analysis and strategic expertise." I outlined the technical requirements, the access needed, the scope of the project. "And," I added, looking directly at Mr. and Mrs. Ashworth, "it requires an understanding that this partnership is built on a foundation of mutual respect, recognizing value for what it is, demonstrated ability and knowledge, not where it comes from." My terms were about ensuring my expertise was integrated, my voice heard, and that the underlying issue of their judgment based on background was addressed, even if implicitly, by their need for my earned merit. They hesitated. There were whispers. With their lawyer and consultant, perhaps a final struggle with their pride, a desire to find any other way. But the severity of their crisis, the undeniable truth of their situation, and the uniqueness of the solution I offered left them no viable alternative. Their faces, etched with the toll of their crisis, finally softened into reluctant, necessary agreement. They accepted my terms. Implementing the solution was a demanding process. My team and I worked closely with the key figures at Ashworth and Co., navigating the complex data sets, unraveling the legal and financial knots, leveraging my understanding of the underlying market dynamics and regulatory landscape that had caused their problem. The unique pathway provided by the knowledge I had gained over the years, the unsuitable expertise, was the exact key needed to navigate their crisis. Slowly, painstakingly, Ashworth & Co. began to stabilize. The complex issue was resolved. The legal and financial threats mitigated. My team's analysis provided the clarity and strategy needed to navigate the stormy waters. The crisis was averted. Ashworth and coworkers, their status preserved, emerged from the brink, fundamentally changed not just by the experience, but by the source of their salvation. After the crisis was over, the dynamics were irrevocably altered. The necessity was gone, but the reality of how they were saved remained. Mr. and Mrs. Ashworth's demeanor towards me was transformed. The polite disdain, the casual superiority, it was completely gone, replaced by a profound, perhaps uncomfortable, respect. They saw me not as the young man from a modest background who wasn't suitable, but as the expert, the strategist, the figure of power who had saved their legacy. When we interacted, their tone was one of genuine regard, sometimes even awe. They had looked down on me, but now they were compelled to look up. My own position was solidified, not just in my own industry, but in their perception. I had achieved my goal, not by tearing them down entirely, but by building my own empire and using its strength to redefine the terms of respect. The value of earned merit, of capability built from the ground up, had triumphed over the arbitrary definition of inherited status. The scar of their initial rejection remained, a reminder of where I came from, but it was now overshadowed by the undeniable proof of where I had gone and what I had become. I had been deemed unsuitable for their world, but I had become the indispensable architect of its survival. The quiet rise was complete, culminating not in revenge, but in the undeniable earned respect that transcended their old definitions of worth.